behind every glittering crown hides a secret. Queens were not only symbols of power, some were restless wanderers pacing palace halls at midnight, others collectors of odd treasures, and a few delighted in disguises and storms more than in jewels. Their lives were stranger, richer, and far more human than the portraits suggest. Tonight, we'll step softly into those stories, calm, steady, and a little curious. Before we begin, don't forget to press like and subscribe so you can return for more nights of quiet history. Now, let's meet Europe's most curious queens. History often remembers monarchs for their crowns, battles, or laws, but sometimes the most telling details are far quieter, like the way one queen never seemed able to rest. In every portrait she looks composed, seated on a throne, gaze steady. But in the recollections of her courtiers, we find a very different picture. She was a woman who walked and kept walking, as though stillness itself was a burden she could never carry. Imagine the palace corridors at night, stone walls echoing the faint sound of footsteps, torches flickering along high ceilings, the hush of a court gone to sleep. Servants would later whisper that long after midnight, when every candle should have burned down and every chamber should have fallen silent, her figure could still be seen drifting through the halls. She touched the locks of doors to ensure they were secure, drew her hand across tapestries as if confirming their threads had not vanished, and checked windows that faced the gardens. To her attendants, these movements seemed restless, even strange. To her, perhaps they were as natural as breathing. Why would a queen do such a thing? One explanation might be unease. After all, to be a monarch was never a life of peace. There were constant worries, the loyalty of nobles, the murmurs of rivals, the fear of betrayal from one's own circle. But there may have been more to it than that. The queen's pacing was not always nervous. Sometimes she walked with the air of someone curious, someone who longed to see her palace, not as a cage, but as a world she could endlessly explore. She paused to admire the way moonlight touched a marble floor, or how the wind rattled the iron latches of a door. Her counselors struggled with her restlessness. In meetings of state, she found it difficult to remain in her gilded chair, while others droned on about trade agreements and border disputes. She would rise, circle the chamber, glance at maps on the walls, or pace behind her ministers, listening but never still. At first this unsettled them. They wondered, is she distracted, careless, or impatient with matters of government? Yet they quickly realized she absorbed every word, sometimes recalling details days later that they had forgotten themselves. Perhaps movement sharpened her thoughts. Much like a scholar who thinks best while strolling in a garden. This habit of constant walking became part of her legend. Foreign ambassadors wrote back home of audiences where the queen never sat, instead leading them through long corridors as she spoke of treaties. They were forced to trail after her, their words bouncing between breaths, their formal speeches turned into hurried conversations as they tried to keep pace. Some envoys were exhausted by the time they reached their point, yet the queen remained, unbothered, energized even. To her, diplomacy was not a ceremony of chairs and tables. It was a matter of motion, of words carried along the length of her palace. Her servants suffered the most from her nightly wanderings. Whenever she rose from bed, guards were required to follow at a distance, their armor clinking softly in the darkness. Maids had to relight candles or open doors she decided to pass through. Yet strangely, none dared complain, for in her restlessness, the queen noticed things others did not. She would spot a torn curtain, a leaky roof, a servant ill at ease, and she addressed these matters with unexpected kindness. "How long has this door been loose on its hinges?" she might ask, and within days a carpenter was summoned. "Why does this guard look pale tonight?" she would remark, and by morning the soldier was allowed rest. Her walks, though exhausting to those who followed, improved life within the palace in small but real ways. There were rumors, too. Some whispered that she wandered because she distrusted, everyone fearing conspiracies behind every locked chamber. Others said she simply could not bear the loneliness of her rooms, where silence pressed too heavily. A few even joked that she counted her palace steps the way some rulers counted their coins, as though pacing itself was her private treasure. Whatever the truth, it gave her an air of unpredictability that no advisor could ignore. What is most curious is how this habit shaped the memory of her reign. She may have signed laws, forged alliances, and overseen great events, but many remembered her most vividly as a figure gliding through moonlit corridors. In paintings created after her death, artists could not resist showing her seated upon a throne, for tradition demanded it. Yet those who had known her would shake their heads and say she was never still. That throne was never her natural place. Perhaps we might see her restlessness not as weakness, but as character. A monarch trapped in endless ceremony might well seek freedom in motion. To walk was to think, to breathe, to remind herself that she was more than a symbol carved into stone. And though her advisors wished she could sit like others, her people learned to respect the queen who never paused, who seemed always searching, always alive in the movement of her steps. In the quiet hours of history, when we imagine her palace, we no longer hear silence. We hear the steady rhythm of footsteps echoing down long corridors, a reminder that even rulers are human, restless, and sometimes most curious in the smallest of habits. Among the most curious queens in European memory was one whose imagination could not be contained by the vastness of her realm. She ruled over cities, castles, and provinces that stretched farther than most of her subjects would ever travel in their lifetimes. Yet she found her greatest joy not in the grandeur of maps spread across council tables, but in something far smaller, in miniature villages no larger than a dining table, crafted with care until they seemed almost alive. First mention of this unusual passion appears in a courtier's diary. He wrote with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement that the queen spent hours each morning inspecting tiny models of farms, houses, and marketplaces. While her ministers argued over taxes and alliances, she adjusted the thatch on a doll-sized roof or rearranged little wooden figures of peasants and merchants. To outsiders it may have seemed childlike, but to her it was a serious pursuit, one she treated with the same gravity as others treated politics. Her collection began modestly. A visiting craftsman presented her with a small carved cottage, complete, with a roof thatched from dried straw and doors that could actually swing open. The queen was entranced. She placed it on a table near her window and returned to it again and again, lifting the roof to peer inside, moving the shutters so the light fell differently. Soon she demanded more. Carpenters, sculptors, and artisans were commissioned to build entire landscapes in miniature. Barns filled with painted animals, mills whose tiny wheels turned when water was poured, churches with bells that chimed when strings were pulled, all crafted with painstaking care. Her private chambers gradually transformed into something extraordinary. Along one wall stretched a mountain range carved from wood and painted with snowy peaks. At its base ran a miniature river of real water, kept flowing by hidden mechanisms. Across the floor spread villages with cobbled streets and town squares where tiny merchants stood beside stalls of painted fruit. There were stables filled with horse figurines, farms with fields of straw dyed golden, and forests of delicate trees made from twisted wire and silk leaves. The queen would sit for hours among them, her crown set aside, carefully adjusting the placement of a house or the angle of a bridge, as though every detail mattered. Visitors to her court found this habit fascinating, if a little unsettling. Diplomats expecting to discuss alliances were instead guided into her miniature world. "Here," she would say, pointing to a model of a market, "this is how trade should flow, smoothly, without obstruction." Or she would move a tiny soldier across a bridge and remark, "See how easily a road can be blocked if not properly guarded." Her ministers began to realize that the queen used her toys not merely for amusement, but as tools of imagination. She saw in them reflections of her realm, simplified, made manageable, and alive in a way that maps on parchment could never achieve. There is a curious practicality in such a passion. Maps can flatten the world into lines and colors, but models gave her a sense of texture and weight. By holding a miniature granary in her hand, she could almost feel the importance of grain supply to her people. By arranging little houses, she imagined how villages might thrive or fail, depending on their layout. Ministers laughed at first, but soon they discovered that many of her decisions, from building roads to placing guard posts, came from ideas she had worked out among her miniatures. Her court may have scoffed, but her kingdom benefited Dot, of course. Some thought it eccentric. A chronicler from a rival court mocked her by saying she played with toys like a child, while her advisors did the real work. But those close to her knew better. They saw how deeply she studied each detail, how she spoke less about jewels or gowns than about the angles of roofs and the spread of markets. She believed these tiny villages contained truths about her subjects' lives that reports and ledgers never revealed. Her obsession grew so large that entire rooms of her palace were given over to these creations. Imagine entering such a space, tables stretched end to end, covered with miniature valleys and towns. Lanterns were hung above to mimic sunlight, their glow reflecting off little rivers. The air carried the scent of fresh paint and sawdust from constant construction. And there, moving slowly between the tables, the queen herself, her gown brushing against the floor, hands carefully adjusting a fence or a bridge no taller than her ankle. One courtier described her posture as she leaned over the models, her face softened, her voice quiet as if she spoke to the little figures themselves. She might lift a tiny farmer carved from wood and say, "This one shall move to the edge of the village where his field will be larger." Then she would place the figurine down with infinite care, as though the decision truly altered a life. To her, perhaps it did not, it is easy to imagine that these miniature worlds gave her a sense of control she could never fully grasp in the vast unpredictability of real politics. In the real world, nobles argued, soldiers disobeyed, and harvests failed. But in her tiny villages, roofs stayed thatched, rivers flowed as she directed, and subjects moved where she wished. The smallness of it made the chaos of reality bearable. It was a queen's version of peace, and yet there was also tenderness in this passion. On feast days, she invited children of servants into her chambers to look at her villages. She would guide them to the tables, letting them peer into miniature barns and turn the little windmills with their fingers. The children laughed in delight, and she laughed with them, her court momentarily forgetting she was monarch and seeing instead a woman who cherished simple joy. Historians later debated what this habit revealed about her. Some argued it showed detachment, that she was lost in fantasy while her realm struggled with real problems. Others believed it revealed a visionary mind, one that grasped the importance of design, order, and planning in ways few rulers did. What cannot be denied is that her miniatures left an impression. After her death, courtiers carefully preserved the villages, displaying them in cabinets as curiosities. Visitors centuries later marveled at their detail and wondered at the queen, who once wandered among them. What makes this story most compelling is how it blurs the line between whimsy and wisdom. Was she simply indulging in an eccentric hobby, or was she shaping policy through play? The truth may be both. In her tiny towns, she experimented with ideas, testing them in wood and straw before imposing them on flesh and stone. In doing so, she revealed that curiosity, even in strange forms, can be a tool of governance. And so, when we think of this queen, we need not picture her only on a throne or in portraits heavy with jewels. We might instead imagine her bending over a table, hands arranging miniature houses, eyes alive with thought. Her crown lies forgotten on a cushion nearby, for at that moment she is not ruler of a vast kingdom, but of a world she can hold in her hands. A curious queen who found the grandest satisfaction in the smallest things. Of all the habits that ever set a monarch apart from her peers, perhaps none was as delicate, as quiet, yet as endlessly curious as the passion one queen held for gloves. In portraits, gloves are often mere accessories folded politely in the hand of a sitter, meant to suggest refinement. But for her, they were not an afterthought. They were the center of a lifelong fascination, a personal language made of silk, leather, and lace. While other rulers collected jewels, rare manuscripts, or exotic treasures, she filled her palaces with gloves, thousands upon thousands of them, each pair bound not by luxury alone, but by memory. The origins of this fascination are wrapped in mystery. Some say it began in her youth, when she was gifted her first pair of fine kid leather gloves at a festival. The scent of the leather, the way it molded to her fingers, the sense that her hands had been transformed, it was an experience she never forgot. Others insist that the habit grew later, when she discovered that gloves were more than mere protection from cold or ornament for ceremony. They were tokens of history, silent witnesses to moments both great and small. A glove worn at a coronation, one brushed against another in greeting, one handed over as a gesture of peace. Each carried the echo of its time. Her collections began modestly, stored in chests lined with cedar to preserve them from moths. A row of silk gloves embroidered with gold thread, a set of velvet gloves lined with fur, a humble pair of woolen gloves from a shepherd brought to court as tribute. She accepted them all with equal care. But as the years passed, her room swelled with cabinets, shelves, and boxes filled to the brim. Courtiers marveled at the variety. There were gloves so small they seemed fit for a child, crafted for dainty hands that prized delicacy above comfort. Others were heavy, made of thick hide, intended for hawking or riding, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. Every glove told a story. Some were gifts from foreign ambassadors brought as part of elaborate ceremonies. A visitor from Italy presented her with a pair scented faintly with jasmine. The leather dyed a pale blue that shifted in the light. From Spain came gloves stitched with patterns so intricate that they seemed woven from sunlight itself. From northern lands she received gloves lined with fur, warm enough to face the harshest winters. She did not merely admire them, she recorded their origins carefully, keeping notes of who presented them, under what circumstances, and what words were exchanged. For her, the glove was not an object but a page in a diary, and her collection became a history written not in ink but in fabric. And leather. Her courtiers at first found the passion amusing, even trivial. They whispered behind her back, calling her obsession a queen's folly. Yet over time they began to see how she used it as a subtle tool of diplomacy. To receive a glove from the queen was no small matter. When she handed a pair to a visiting noble, it was not merely a gift. It was a gesture carefully chosen. A glove meant protection, loyalty, or even intimacy. By giving a pair to an ally, she symbolically joined their hands with her own. By presenting them to a rival, she offered both challenge and respect. In a world where words could be twisted and treaties broken, gloves became her silent language, carrying messages no pen could write. There were stories of how ambassadors struggled to interpret her meaning. Was a pair of gloves embroidered with roses a sign of favor or of polite dismissal? Did a gift of thick riding gloves suggest trust and strength or a warning of hardship? Courtiers puzzled over these questions late into the night, as though decoding the queen's glove giving was as important as deciphering state secrets. In truth, perhaps it was. Her personal chambers grew into a museum of this passion. Imagine walking into those rooms, shelves upon shelves rising to the ceiling, every drawer filled with neatly folded pairs. Some were displayed on stands shaped like hands, fingers extended gracefully as though ready to move. Others lay in boxes lined with velvet, carefully separated by silk paper. The air carried the faint, mingling scents of leather, perfumes, and old fabric, not unpleasant, but heavy with history. Servants tasked with maintaining the collection moved quietly, dusting cases and refreshing cedar shavings to keep moths at bay. Visitors were astonished not only by the number, but by her memory of them. She could walk to a cabinet, open a drawer, and draw out a pair with perfect recollection of its story. These, she might say, holding out white silk gloves, were worn the evening we signed the treaty that brought peace to our border. Or she would present a pair of heavy gauntlets and remark, "These came from a soldier who rode farther than any other to deliver news of victory." To her, the gloves were not mere ornaments. They were evidence, proof of life lived, moments preserved. Her attachment bordered on the ritualistic. She rarely attended an event without choosing gloves that matched the occasion. For solemn ceremonies, she wore plain, white, pure, and understated. For celebrations, she chose bright colors and embroidered designs, catching the eye of everyone in the hall. Courtiers soon realized that by studying her gloves, they could predict her mood. When she appeared in gloves with bold patterns, It meant she was prepared to speak decisively. When she chose soft hues and delicate stitching, she signaled a gentler mood. Few monarchs have ever communicated so much through such a subtle medium. Over time, her glove collection shaped even the fashions of her court. Nobles scrambled to imitate her choices, commissioning gloves from the same craftsmen she favored. Markets thrived on the demand, with merchants boasting of styles fit for a queen. Artisans grew wealthy, crafting intricate pairs, some so ornate they were never meant to be worn at all but only admired. The queen's obsession, once mocked, had become a trend that spread far beyond the palace walls. And yet, for all its splendor, there was also something deeply human in her fascination. Gloves, after all, are objects meant to fit the hand, too. Warm, to protect, to carry the imprint of their wearer. They are intimate, close to the body, touched daily. Perhaps the queen understood this better than anyone. In collecting gloves, she was collecting fragments of humanity, tiny traces of lives that brushed against her own. A glove once held in someone else's hand carried their warmth, their scent, their presence, however faint. She could not hold her entire kingdom in her arms, but she could hold its gloves, and through them feel connected. There is a quiet poignancy in this. A ruler is often distant, elevated on thrones and hidden behind ceremony. But through her gloves the queen reached down to the level of everyday touch. She preserved not only her own memories but those of others. A farmer's rough woolen gloves, a court dancer's delicate lace, a soldier's worn leather, all found their place beside the richest silks. In her collection, all hands were equal, and all lives left a trace. In the end, her legacy was shaped as much by this passion as by her politics. Chroniclers noted the strangeness, yes, but also the dedication, the seriousness with which she pursued it. Some historians dismiss it as eccentricity, the harmless hobby of a queen with too much time. Others see it as a metaphor for her reign itself, a weaving together of countless lives bound not by conquest or decree, but by the gentler thread of memory. And so, when we think of her today, we need not picture her only in state portraits, stiff and formal. Instead, we can imagine her seated before a cabinet, carefully unfolding a pair of gloves, fingers brushing the fabric as she recalls the moment they represent. Perhaps she smiles faintly, lost in thought, before setting them back in place, content that she has preserved not just an object, but a memory. In that simple act, repeated countless times across her life, lies the quiet curiosity that made her so unforgettable. A queen whose history was written in leather and silk, in stitches and seams, in the touch of hands that once were warm and now live only in her collection. There are queens remembered for crowns that glittered brighter than the sun, and there are queens remembered for palaces that rose like mountains of stone. But this queen is remembered for something far more curious, for the masks she wore, the disguises she cherished, and the strange delight she found in slipping out of her palace unseen, wandering among her subjects as though she were anyone but herself. While most rulers clung to their thrones, wrapped in ceremony, she longed for escape, and her escape came not in carriages or retreats, but in costumes, cloaks, and false names. Her courtiers could never predict when the urge would seize her. On some evenings, after hours of council debates and formal greetings, she would rise from her gilded chair with a certain glimmer in her eyes. "Tonight," she would say quietly, "I will see the world as they see it." At once trusted. Servants would rush to her private chambers, where an array of disguises awaited. There were coarse woolen gowns no different from those worn by common market women, patched cloaks meant to look travel-worn, and caps designed to hide her hair. She owned masks of every kind, plain leather half-masks that shaded her eyes, delicate painted visors that hid her features, and even crude coverings made to resemble scars or age. Each disguise was chosen carefully, not as a game of theater, but as a tool of freedom. Once dressed, she slipped into the night with only a handful of companions sworn to secrecy. The palace gates opened silently, and soon she was gone into the streets, her identity hidden, her footsteps no different from those of the countless others who wandered the city after dark. To those who passed her, she was a traveler, a widow, a merchant's wife, perhaps even a servant. No one guessed she was queen, and in that anonymity she found what no crown could give. The pulse of the world, unfiltered, alive, real. She visited marketplaces most often. By day she could see them from the safety of her balcony, but by night, masked and cloaked, she walked their narrow lanes herself. She leaned close to stalls of fruit, fingering apples to test their firmness. She listened as vendors shouted prices, as buyers bargained fiercely over scraps of cloth, as children darted between carts with sticky fingers. The queen asked questions of merchants. How was the harvest? Were the roads safe? Was the tax collector fair? And the answers came freely, for no one knew they were speaking to their ruler. Later, back in her palace, she repeated these stories to her ministers, sometimes to their embarrassment, for she knew truths they had failed to report. But the marketplaces were not her only stage. On certain nights she wandered into taverns, sitting among sailors and laborers as though she belonged. She drank from plain wooden cups, rolled dice on rough tables, and listened to the laughter and quarrels around her. Few queens in history ever heard such conversations, words spoken with no fear, no polish, no thought that a monarch might be listening. From these visits she learned more than any ambassador could tell her. How men cursed the weight of taxes, how women whispered of shortages, how soldiers bragged of victories or complained of hunger. The palace could filter news, but in disguise. She heard the unvarnished truth. Not all her disguises were meant for listening. Sometimes she donned them simply for play. On festivals she joined parades, masked like countless others, dancing in the streets until dawn. Courtiers later confessed their horror at discovering she had mingled so closely with strangers, risking insult or worse. But to her it was joy. I am not only queen, she once told a confidant. I am also a woman who wishes to feel the world with her own hands. Her laughter rang louder under a mask, her steps freer in borrowed shoes, not, of course. There was danger. Rumors spread quickly when her absences were noticed, and guards scrambled to keep her safe without revealing her secret. On more than one occasion, she narrowly avoided recognition. Once, a merchant swore he had seen her eyes beneath a mask, and she spent weeks denying it with practiced ease. Another time, a drunken sailor grew suspicious of her fine speech and pressed too close, only to be driven off by one of her disguised attendants. Yet she never abandoned the practice. The risks only sharpened her thrill, and perhaps deepened her sense of closeness to her people, for she had lived as they did, if only for a night that her court did not know what to make of it. Some whispered that she was reckless, risking scandal and danger for trifles. Others believed she was cunning, using disguises to test the loyalty of her subjects and the honesty of her ministers. A few thought it merely eccentricity, a strange whim of a restless monarch. But those who observed her carefully noticed the results. Policies she proposed often reflected the real conditions she had seen with her own eyes. When she lowered a tax, it was because she had heard the groans of a poor family in a market stall. When she punished corrupt officials, it was because she had listened to whispered tales of their abuse in a tavern corner. Her disguises gave her knowledge no advisor could filter, and she wielded it with precision. Her fascination with masks extended beyond the streets. Within her palace, she hosted masquerades unlike any other. Ballrooms filled with courtiers glittered in candlelight, every face hidden behind elaborate coverings. At these events, rank vanished for a night. A duke might find himself speaking to a servant unaware of their identity, while a maid might dance with a minister. The queen herself appeared masked, mingling unnoticed among her guests, listening to gossip spoken more freely when identities were concealed. Some despised these games, finding them unsettling, but others delighted in them, for they revealed truths that status often concealed. Historians have often asked why she loved disguises so deeply. Was it rebellion against the heavy weight of monarchy? Was it a search for freedom in a life where every step was watched? Or was it strategy, a clever method of gathering intelligence and keeping her court perpetually uncertain of how much she truly knew? Perhaps it was all of these things. To wear a mask is to escape oneself, to become both hidden and powerful. And few rulers understood that better than she did in the end. Her reign was remembered not only for treaties and decrees, but for the restless figure who slipped into the night dressed as a commoner, for the monarch who preferred the noise of crowded streets to the silence of her throne room. Her masks became symbols, not of deception, but of curiosity, a reminder that even the highest of rulers longed to see the world through other eyes. And so, when we imagine her today, we may picture not the glittering crown, but the humble cloak, pulled tight against the chill, not the throne, but the rough bench of a tavern, not the stiff portraits, but the flicker of a masked smile disappearing into the crowd. She was a queen who ruled not only by decree, but by disguise, and in that strangeness she remains one of history's most curious figures. There are queens who loved jewels, queens who loved banquets, queens who loved pageantry. Yet in the memory of her court, this queen is recalled for something far stranger. She loved storms, not the calm drizzle of gentle rain, not the passing showers that refreshed a summer garden. No, she longed for the rolling thunder, the jagged streaks of lightning that split the sky, the wild winds that shook shutters and rattled doors. While others trembled, she laughed. While servants hurried to bar the windows, she ordered them thrown wide so she could watch the tempest unfold. Imagine her palace on such a night. The air grows heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth, and clouds gather over the horizon, pressing dark upon the land. Courtiers begin to grow uneasy, whispering of the storm that approaches. Servants hurry to secure tapestries, to snuff out excess flames, lest the wind scatter sparks. Guards tighten their cloaks, uneasy at the groan of the weather. And in the highest chamber of the palace, the queen stands by the balcony, her eyes I light waiting. Then, at last, the first rumble of thunder rolls across the sky, deep and long like a drum of the heavens. Where others shudder, she straightens, her lips curving in a smile. The lightning comes, splitting the black night in blinding silver, and for a moment the palace gardens below are revealed in startling clarity. The hedges glisten with sudden rain, the fountains leap white and cold. The statues loom like living beings. In that brief flash, the world is new, alive, electric. The queen steps forward onto the balcony, her gown tugged by the wind, her hair whipped across her face. Courtiers cry out for her to come inside, to protect herself, but she waves them off. She wants the storm not at a distance, but around her, filling her ears, her lungs, her very bones. There were many tales of these nights. One chronicler described how she would sit by the window with shutters wide, allowing rain to spatter across the marble floor. She placed her hand against the wet stone, as if greeting the storm personally. Another wrote of how she once ordered musicians to play during a thunderstorm, not to drown it out, but to join it. The sound of violins quivered alongside thunder. The steady beat of drums echoed the roll of the heavens, and she listened with rapture, declaring that no music was more grand than when nature itself joined the orchestra. Why did she love storms so? Some believed it was defiance, a refusal to bow to fear. While courtiers crossed themselves in terror of thunder, she faced it boldly, proving that no power of nature could unnerve her. Others thought it was kinship, just as storms were unpredictable, fierce, and alive with energy, so too was her spirit. She ruled with passion, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, never entirely still, and perhaps in storms she saw a reflection of herself. Her fascination was not limited to mere watching. She collected accounts of great storms across her kingdom, demanding that governors send her reports not only of floods or damage, but of the way the sky looked, the sounds the people heard, the shapes lightning made across the horizon. She read these reports with more interest than she ever gave to matters of taxation. "Tell me how the sky burned," she once demanded of a messenger who had witnessed a lightning strike near a village. The poor man, unprepared, stammered out a description, and though clumsy, it pleased her. She rewarded him richly, not for bravery or service, but for words that captured the storm. At times she sought storms out, ordering her carriages to drive her to hilltops where winds were fiercest and lightning brightest. Imagine the sight: a royal carriage rattling through rain-slick roads, horses straining against wind, servants cursing under their breath, while inside the queen leaned forward eagerly, urging them onward. Upon reaching the heights, she would step out, rain soaking her cloak, and lift her arms to the sky as if greeting an old friend. Those who witnessed it never forgot the vision of their queen. Drenched but radiant, her laughter carried off by the wind. Her people soon began to weave stories about her. Farmers said that when storms came, the queen was out there somewhere, urging the thunder louder, calling the rain harder. Sailors joked that she was the secret patron of tempests, and that her laughter could be heard across the waves. Some even began to believe that storms favored her reign, breaking long droughts or driving away armies with sudden downpours. Whether true or not, the association of queen and storm grew inseparable. Of course, not everyone admired this passion. Ministers complained that she endangered herself, standing exposed to wind and lightning. Doctors warned that her health would suffer from such reckless behavior. Some courtiers whispered that it was unbecoming of a queen to delight in such chaos, yet she paid no heed. To her, storms were not chaos, but majesty. A throne is stone, she once remarked, but a storm is alive. For a woman bound by endless ritual, perhaps storms gave her the freedom she craved. A reminder that some forces could never be controlled, only embraced. Her love of storms even crept into her. Politics. When addressing her council, she sometimes compared policies to weather. A sudden tax is like lightning, she explained once, brilliant but dangerous, leaving scars. A gradual change is like steady rain, nourishing though slow. Ministers marveled at these metaphors, which seemed fanciful at first, yet proved wise. She saw the moods of her kingdom as one might see clouds, building, shifting, threatening, and she governed accordingly, watching for the pressure before the thunder fell. One of the most famous stories tells of a grand banquet held during a violent storm. Guests trembled at each thunderclap, but the queen insisted the windows remain open. As the storm raged, she stood and raised her cup to the lightning outside, declaring, "There is no crown brighter than that." For a moment, silence held the hall, broken only by thunder. Then, seeing her calm, the guests dared to relax, and laughter returned. In her presence, fear itself seemed to bow. When at last her reign ended and her life passed into memory, storms did not fade from her story. Chroniclers describe the night she died, and though accounts differ, many swore a thunderstorm swept across the land, as if the heavens themselves mourned her departure. Others, perhaps more fanciful, claimed lightning struck near the palace, a final salute to the queen who had loved it so. Whether truth or legend, the tale endured, binding her forever to the tempests she had cherished. And so, when we recall her today, we need not picture her only in jewel-laden halls or on gilded thrones. We can imagine her standing on a balcony, rain running down her face, hair whipped wild by the wind, eyes alive with joy as thunder rolled overhead. She was not afraid, not hesitant, not restrained. She was the queen who loved storms, who welcomed the wildness of the sky into her soul, and who taught those around her that even in chaos there is beauty, and even in fear there is wonder. In the annals of European courts, it was common enough for kings and princes to receive gifts of animals from distant lands. A pair of hunting dogs from a loyal noble, a fine horse from a neighboring ruler, or perhaps a hawk trained for falconry. These were expected tokens, symbols of wealth and friendship. But there was one queen who took this custom further than anyone could have imagined. For her, exotic animals were not merely curiosities or symbols of prestige. They became companions, almost members of her household. Her palace gardens turned into something halfway between a royal residence and a living menagerie, a place where creatures of every shape and size startled visiting diplomats and amazed ordinary servants. Her fascination began early in her reign, when an ambassador from the East presented her with a bird unlike any her people had ever seen. Tall, elegant, its long neck curved like a question mark, its feathers shimmering in pale hues. It was a creature that seemed born from myth rather than nature. Courtiers gasped at its appearance, whispering that it could not possibly be real. Yet there it was, striding calmly through the palace courtyard, as if it had always belonged. The queen was entranced. She spent hours watching it, following its movements and feeding it by hand. To her, it was not a symbol but a marvel, a living link to worlds beyond her borders. From that day forward, animals poured into her palace like treasures. Diplomats, aware of her passion, scrambled to outdo one another with rarer, stranger gifts. From southern lands came brightly colored parrots that squawked loudly in the halls, imitating the laughter of courtiers to everyone's amusement. From colder northern regions came white-furred creatures that padded silently across the stone floors, their breath misting in the air. Traders brought monkeys with quick fingers and quicker tempers, who leapt from beam to beam and delighted in stealing fruit from banquet tables. The queen welcomed them all. Her gardens, once neatly trimmed and arranged for elegance, became wild with life. Tall aviaries rose near the fountains, filled with birds of every shade. Spacious enclosures lined the paths, housing animals rarely seen outside of travelers' tailies. She strolled among them daily, not as a distant ruler but as a caretaker, offering food with her own hands, speaking to them in gentle tones. Ministers waiting for her audience often found themselves delayed, forced to trail after her, while she lingered by a cage, laughing at the antics of a mischievous animal. Not everyone shared her delight. Courtiers complained of noise and mess. Servants groaned at the endless task of feeding and cleaning. Some nobles sneered that a queen should devote herself to diplomacy, not to animals, but she paid them no mind. To her, these creatures embodied the wonder of the wider world. They reminded her that her realm was not the center of all things, that beyond its borders lay endless diversity. In their feathers, fur, and eyes she saw stories no chronicler could write. One of her favorite companions was a bear gifted by traders from a distant land. It was young when it arrived, small enough to be led on a leash through the palace halls. She raised it carefully, feeding it herself, and it grew to follow her with surprising gentleness. Courtiers were shocked when they saw her walking through gardens with the bear at her side, as calm as any dog. Children of servants squealed in delight at the sight, and though guards fretted at the danger, the queen never showed fear. To her, the bear was not a beast but a loyal friend. Even more notorious was the monkey she allowed to attend council meetings. The creature perched on the back of her chair, watching ministers with bright, curious eyes. Whenever a noble gestured dramatically, the monkey mimicked him, raising its tiny hands in mock seriousness, sending the room into reluctant laughter. Though some considered it an insult to the dignity of government, the queen enjoyed the reminder that solemnity could sometimes be foolish. She even remarked once, with a mischievous smile, that the monkey's gestures made more sense than certain speeches. Travelers who visited her court returned home with astonishing stories. They told of dining halls where brightly colored birds swooped between rafters, of gardens where strange beasts lounged in the sun, of balconies where the queen herself scattered grain to flocks of creatures that should never have thrived so far from their native lands. Her palace became as famous for its animals as for its architecture. Some said visiting her was like stepping into another world, a place where borders dissolved and nature itself came to pay homage. Of course, keeping such a menagerie was no simple matter. The queen spared no expense in maintaining her collection. Special caretakers were hired from distant regions, men and women who knew the habits of these creatures better than local servants could. Stables were modified into habitats, fountains into pools, courtyards into miniature forests. Physicians who usually tended humans were sometimes called upon to treat animals, puzzling over ailments they had never studied before. Yet the queen demanded it, and so it was done. Her affection for her animals became legendary. She knew each by sight, remembered their quirks, and often spoke of them as though they were courtiers themselves. The bear dislikes loud noises, she once remarked, as if commenting on a nobleman's temperament. The parrot prefers figs over apples, she said another time, with the seriousness of one planning a treaty. Her affection blurred the lines between ruler and caretaker, between court and cage. Some historians believe her passion for animals reflected her deeper nature. She was a queen caught between the rigid structures of power and her longing for freedom. In animals she found honesty. A bird did not flatter her, a bear did not plot against her, a monkey did not disguise its mischief. They lived as they were, without deception, and in their company she could lower her guard. Perhaps she envied their simplicity, their ability to live without masks or ceremony. And yet, her fascination also had political effects. Foreign rulers, recognizing her passion, competed to send the rarest creatures, hoping to win her favor. A diplomat who brought an unusual bird or beast often found negotiations smoother, for the queen was grateful in ways that extended beyond mere courtesy. Thus her menagerie became an unspoken channel of diplomacy, its cages and aviaries echoing with the sounds of alliances as much as with the cries of animals. In time her court came to accept, even to celebrate, this strangeness. The queen was known as eccentric, yes, but also as a woman of boundless curiosity. Her gardens became a symbol of her reign, a place where the world's diversity was gathered and honored. Children grew up remembering the wonder of seeing creatures they never imagined, and visitors carried home tales that spread her fame across Europe. When she died, her animals became the subject of debate. Some were returned to the lands they had come from, others gifted to nobles, still others preserved as tokens of her extraordinary life. But none could replace the image of her walking among them, fearless, delighted, alive with joy at their presence. In the memory of her people, she would always be the queen of the menagerie, the ruler whose court echoed not only with the voices of men, but with the cries, songs, and roars of creatures from every corner of the earth. And so, when we recall her today, we do not think only of her throne or her crown. We imagine her seated in a sunlit garden, a parrot perched on her shoulder, a bear dozing at her feet, a monkey chattering from the rafters. We hear her laughter, mingling with the sounds of the wild, and we understand why her court called her the most curious of all. She was not merely a queen of people, she was, in her own strange way, a queen of creatures too. Some queens are remembered for their speeches, their proclamations shouted in public squares, or their solemn decrees carved into law. But this queen, curious beyond measure, was remembered for the quiet scratching of quills against parchment, the endless flow of ink across page after page. She was above all else a writer, not a poet, not a novelist, not a philosopher in the ordinary sense, though some might argue she was all of those things in her own way. She was a queen who could not stop writing letters. It began as duty, of course. Every monarch was expected to write letters to allies, to distant cousins, to neighboring rulers whose tempers needed soothing. A queen was expected to thank nobles for their loyalty, to congratulate generals for their victories, to send condolences when someone of rank passed away. But for her, the duty became something more. The pen, once a tool of formality, turned into her constant companion. Ministers joked that she wrote more words in a week than most scribes produced in a month, and there was truth in it. Her letters poured forth with such abundance that by the end of her reign, whole libraries were filled with the weight of her hand. At first, the letters followed the expected path. Diplomatic niceties, polished phrases designed to please. Yet soon her words wandered. A message to a fellow queen about trade might drift into a meditation on the shape of clouds she had seen that morning. A formal note to a nobleman might contain 3 extra pages describing the color of leaves in her gardens that autumn. She could not resist the urge to describe, to narrate, to capture life in detail. The recipients of her letters often found themselves bewildered, charmed, or occasionally overwhelmed. One ambassador confessed that he read her correspondence twice, once to understand her political instructions, and again to savor her rambling observations on the world around her. Her letters were not limited to the mighty. She wrote to servants who had attended her banquets, thanking them for their work. She wrote to gardeners who tended her roses, offering suggestions for arranging blooms. She wrote to ship captains who had never seen her face, sending encouragement for their journeys. If she heard of a merchant who had traveled far, she demanded his address and sent him pages of questions about what he had seen. When a soldier returned from war, she asked for his story in writing, and when he struggled to compose it, she replied with words of comfort, filling page after page with encouragement. To her, no person was too small, no subject too ordinary for her pen. The palace scribes were at first delighted. Here was a queen who valued the written word above all else, who gave them endless work, who treated ink and parchment as treasures rather than tools. But soon the pace overwhelmed them. She demanded paper of the finest quality, quills cut daily to perfect sharpness, and ink mixed to her exact preference. Day and night, messengers hurried in and out of the palace, carrying stacks of her letters. Across the land, the couriers groaned, their satchels bulging, their horses weary from constant travel. Yet the queen was relentless. If she thought of a detail not included, she dashed off another note at once, sending messengers chasing after the first batch to deliver just one more page. Her ministers complained bitterly that she wasted time better spent on affairs of state, but they failed to see how cleverly she wove governance into her letters. A nobleman expecting a simple greeting might discover, hidden among her flowery descriptions, a subtle instruction about managing his estate. A general might receive encouragement wrapped around a quiet warning about loyalty. A neighboring monarch might open what seemed a casual exchange about weather, only to find careful suggestions about trade routes embedded within. She ruled not through thunderous proclamations, but through the steady rain of letters that reached every corner of her realm. Her passion bordered on obsession. She wrote in the mornings before breakfast, in the afternoons while courtiers droned on about taxes, in the evenings by candlelight when others sought rest. Her attendants often found her asleep at her desk, quill still in hand, ink stains marking her fingers. When she traveled, she carried boxes of parchment, refusing to leave behind her paper kingdom. At hunting lodges and carriages on river barges, the scratching of her pen followed her everywhere. It is said that she often asked herself questions in letters, as though writing to her own mind. Should I trust this nobleman? She once wrote in a note addressed to no one. Below it, she answered herself, yes, but cautiously. His eyes flicker when he speaks. Another time she mused, is it better to rule by fear or kindness? And below she filled an entire page with arguments for both sides, concluding only with, perhaps it depends on the day. These letters to herself were never meant for others, yet many were preserved, giving us an intimate portrait of a queen who thought in ink. Visitors to her court were astonished by the sheer volume of paper. Cabinets overflowed with tied bundles of correspondence, each neatly labeled, each carefully dated. Servants shuffled constantly, carrying stacks to the archives where clerks worked tirelessly to catalog them. The weight of her words grew, so immense that architects were forced to design new rooms in the palace to hold them. Whole wings became libraries, shelves bending under the strain of parchment. And still she wrote. Her love for letters also had its lighter side. She enjoyed playing games with her writing, sending riddles to her cousins, or composing verses hidden within otherwise formal texts. One famous example is a letter to a duke, in which every first word of each sentence spelled out a secret phrase. The duke, puzzled, only discovered the message weeks later, to his great embarrassment. For her, the joy was not only in communication, but in the act of shaping words, in the way ink carried thought to paper, and paper carried thought across distance. Some historians argue that her passion changed the very culture of her time. Nobles began writing more themselves, imitating her style. Merchants proudly displayed her letters as treasures, passing them down through generations. Even farmers spoke of the Queen's paper, marveling that their monarch had taken the time to address their concerns directly. In an age when rulers were often distant and unreachable, her letters created intimacy, a sense that her hand could reach into every household. Of course, there were critics. Some claimed she flooded the realm with so many words that their value diminished. Others worried that she revealed too much, that her honesty in private correspondence could be twisted by enemies. And indeed, a few of her letters fell into the wrong hands used by rivals to mock her eccentricity. Yet even her critics admitted they had never seen such devotion to the written word. When she grew old, her writing slowed, but it never ceased. Even when her hand shook and her eyes dimmed, she demanded her quills and ink. Her last letters, written in a wavering script, were sent to childhood friends she had not seen in decades, filled with memories of games, laughter, and sunshine. I write, she confessed in one, because it keeps the past alive. When the ink dries, I am still here, in these words, no matter what becomes of me. After her death, her letters became her monument. Unlike statues that crumble or jewels that fade from fashion, her words endured. Scholars pore over them to this day, marveling at the detail, the curiosity, the humanity that spilled from her pen. She remains one of the most vivid queens in history, not because of battles won or palaces built, but because her voice still whispers from the pages she left behind. And so, when we remember her, we might not imagine her seated on a throne or leading a procession. Instead, we picture her at a desk, candlelight flickering, quill scratching steadily across parchment while the palace sleeps. Cabinets around her overflow with pages, Messengers wait wearily at the door, yet she writes on tireless content. History books often speak of rulers who changed the course of nations with treaties, battles, or reforms. Yet sometimes power reveals itself in quieter, stranger ways. This queen, remembered with both admiration and bewilderment, possessed a gift unlike any other. She could alter the fashions of her realm in a single evening. While most trends take years to spread, creeping slowly from palace to city, from noble to merchant, from merchant to peasant, her choices carried the force of law without ever being written. If she appeared at a ball wearing sleeves an inch longer than expected, the next morning tailors across the capital received frantic orders to copy them. If she adorned her hair with a new ornament, merchants sold out of it by midday. Her power over fabric and feather, over silk and lace, was as swift as lightning. Her fascination with dress was no small vanity. From the moment she ascended the throne, she understood that clothing was more than mere protection or beauty. It was language. A gown could declare wealth. A ribbon could signal allegiance. A color could whisper defiance or proclaim joy. Where other monarchs wielded armies, she wielded garments. She treated her wardrobe as a tool of rule, a way to shape not only her own image, but the very rhythm of her society. Every morning began with the same ritual. Attendants entered her dressing chambers carrying armfuls of fabrics, boxes of jewels, trays of feathers and ribbons. The room itself was a treasury of fashion, towering wardrobes filled with silks from Italy, velvets from Spain, brocades woven with gold thread, and delicate lace fine enough to slip through a ring. Yet she did not simply choose what to wear, based on luxury or comfort. She studied, deliberated, and calculated. Her choices were made with an eye for impact, for the reaction they would provoke, for the whispers they would spark in corridors and salons. One courtier wrote that attending her dressing ritual was like watching a general plan a campaign. She asked questions of her attendants, as though preparing for battle. What shade of blue had the merchants brought in this season? Which noble women had been seen wearing feathers in their hair last week? Which fabrics were scarce in the markets? Then, after long thought, she would select her gown, not at random but with intent. If a color was rare, she wore it to raise its value. If a style was growing too common, she abandoned it to mark her distinction. She played with fashion as others played with politics, and she always won. Her influence spread with astonishing speed. The night she appeared at a masquerade wearing a gown with sleeves cut unusually wide, the hall gasped in surprise. The next day, seamstresses across the city were overwhelmed with demands for sleeves in the same style. When she placed a tall plume in her hair, courtiers scrambled to find feathers, and within days markets were empty of them. A month later, poor women in villages tied stalks of wheat into their hair, desperate to imitate the look in whatever way they could. The queen's choices rippled outward like circles in water, touching even those who would never see her in person. Sometimes her decisions bewildered her subjects, yet they obeyed all the same. Once she wore a gown dyed in a shade of green so harsh that even her closest ladies winced. But within weeks, every noblewoman in the court wore the same color, and poets praised it as the hue of youth and vitality. Another time she appeared at a banquet without any jewels at all, her gown plain white, unadorned, shocking in its simplicity. Courtiers murmured that she had lost her sense. Yet within days, simplicity became the new mark of sophistication, and markets reported an unusual surge in demand for uncolored linen. Her ministers sometimes worried about the economic consequences of her whims. When she wore a style that required yards upon yards of fabric, demand soared so sharply that prices doubled, straining merchants and angering commoners. When she abandoned a fashion abruptly, whole industries suffered, their stocks suddenly worthless. Yet she never slowed. To her, fashion was alive, and it obeyed her heartbeat. She could not imagine restraining it any more than she could restrain the wind. Visitors from abroad were astonished. Ambassadors wrote home in disbelief that a single woman's sleeve or ribbon could alter the attire of an entire nation. Some tried to harness her power for their own gain, bringing rare fabrics or ornaments in hopes she would favor them. If she wore their gift, their merchants grew rich overnight. If she ignored it, fortunes collapsed. In this way she became an unspoken force in international trade, her taste shaping the flow of goods across borders. And yet, for all her extravagance, she was not without purpose. She used fashion to send messages more subtle than any proclamation. When she wished to signal peace with a neighbor, she wore their national color at court, allowing the message to spread without a word. When she wished to chastise her nobles, for pride she dressed simply, reminding them that wealth need not always glitter. When she wished to inspire loyalty, she wore garments embroidered with symbols of her realm, so that everyone who looked upon her saw not only a queen but the very image of their land. There were evenings when she delighted in confusing her courtiers. She would appear in a style so outlandish that no one dared copy it at first, thinking it a jest. Then, weeks later, she wore it again and again, until at last it became impossible to resist. What seemed absurd on the first night became desirable by the third, and eventually inevitable. She proved again and again that she could bend taste to her will, that beauty was not discovered but decreed. Her personal love of fashion was genuine. 2. She adored the feel of fabrics against her skin, the shimmer of silk in candlelight, the weight of velvet on winter nights. She spent hours not only choosing but examining her clothes, running her fingers across the seams, marveling at the craftsmanship. She invited tailors into her chambers to explain their work, listening with fascination as they described dyes, stitches, and techniques. She treated them with respect unusual for a queen, knowing that their skill was the true source of her magic. Of course, there were critics. Some accused her of frivolity, of caring more for ribbons than for governance. They whispered that she ruled through vanity, that her obsession with dress distracted from real issues. But others defended her, pointing out that by commanding fashion, she commanded loyalty. People might grumble about taxes, but they eagerly followed her style. In clothing, she built unity, a shared language of fabric that bound nobles and commoners. Alike to her reign, as she grew older, her style evolved. Youth had brought her extravagance, but age brought refinement. She abandoned the wildest fashions and embraced elegance, proving once more that she set the rhythm, not her critics. Even when her hair turned white, she turned it into trend, appearing at a banquet with no dyes or powders, her natural color shining proudly. Within weeks, noble women who had hidden their age for years followed her example, and suddenly wisdom itself became fashionable. When she died, her wardrobe became a relic of her reign, Cabinets upon cabinets were filled with gowns, shoes, gloves, jewels, and ornaments, each marked with the date she first wore them. Historians wandered those rooms in awe, seeing not just clothing, but the story of a kingdom told in fabric. Every hemline, every sleeve, every ribbon marked a moment in history when an entire nation shifted in response to one woman's choice. And so, when we remember her today, we do not need to imagine her only as a figure of politics. We can see her standing before a mirror, attendants buzzing around her, as she lifts a gown from its hanger and studies it with calm, deliberate eyes. She is not merely dressing herself, she is preparing to dress her nation. With a single decision, she will shape tomorrow's markets, tomorrow's banquets, tomorrow's gossip. She was the queen who changed fashion overnight, and her legacy was woven not in marble or ink, but in the endless folds of fabric that moved wherever she wished. Some queens collected jewels until their vaults overflowed. Some surrounded themselves with poets and musicians, their nights filled with song. But this queen found her delight in a stranger realm altogether, the realm of invention, of clever. Contraptions made of gears and springs, of wheels that spun and figures that moved without human touch. In an age long before electricity or engines, when most nobles were content with feather quills and candlelight, she was entranced by the hum and click of mechanical devices. Her courtiers whispered of her eccentricity, yet they never ceased to marvel when she unveiled her latest treasure, a bird that flapped its wings on command, a tiny carriage that rolled across a table, a clock that not only told the hour but played a melody with chimes as delicate as raindrops dot her fascination. Began with a simple gift. A craftsman, hoping to gain favor, presented her with a clock unlike any she had ever seen. Its face glimmered with golden numbers, its hands moved with smooth precision, and most wondrous of all, at the stroke of noon a small door opened to reveal a figure that bowed politely before retreating back inside. The queen clapped her hands with delight. She asked the craftsman 1,000 questions: how the gears turned, how the springs coiled, how such motion could come from metal alone. From that day onward, her appetite for such marvels knew no bounds. She filled her palace with mechanical wonders. Hallways echoed not only with footsteps, but with the ticking of countless clocks, each more elaborate than the last. Some displayed phases of the moon, others marked the tides of the sea. In her private chambers, cabinets stood filled with devices, birds carved from wood that sang when wounded, miniature fountains that sent water flowing in circles, tiny soldiers that marched across tabletops. Courtiers visiting her were as likely to be shown a new contraption as a new crown. She would wind a key, release a figure, and watch with childlike joy as the invention performed its trick. But her passion was not passive. She did not merely collect. She studied. She summoned craftsmen from across the land, inviting them to her workshops hidden within the palace. There she questioned them endlessly, demanding explanations of springs, weights, and levers. She peered over their shoulders as they filed gears and adjusted screws, her curiosity insatiable. Ministers waiting for her audience often found her hunched over a table cluttered with tools, hair falling into her face as she examined a half-finished device. "I must understand how it works," she would murmur, tracing the path of a gear with her finger. Her enthusiasm changed the very rhythm of her court. While other palaces buzzed with talk of wars and taxes, hers buzzed with the whir of machines. Inventors flocked to her, for she not only welcomed their experiments, but rewarded them richly. A toy maker from the city presented her with a tiny automaton that wrote her name on paper. She gave him gold enough to fund his workshop for years. A foreign engineer brought a miniature organ powered by water pressure. She placed it in her garden fountains, where its music played softly as Lily floated by. In her reign, mechanical marvels became not curiosities but a culture. Diplomats were astonished when they visited. Instead of solemn ceremonies, they were sometimes greeted by strange performances. At one banquet, the queen unveiled a dining table that rose from beneath the floor, already laden with dishes. Guests gasped as it ascended, steady and silent, as though carried by invisible hands. At another gathering, a golden swan was placed in the center of the hall. When wounded, it bent its neck gracefully, dipped into a stream of silver fish, and appeared to swallow them. Nobles applauded, unsure whether to be impressed or unnerved. To her it was not spectacle, but joy, proof that imagination could give life to metal. Of course, her love of gadgets had critics. Some courtiers muttered that she wasted coin better spent on soldiers or ships. Others feared that her fascination with toys made her seem frivolous in the eyes of rivals. Yet she defended herself calmly. "These machines," she once declared, "are more than play. They are proof that the world can be shaped by thought. A crown may command, but a gear obeys." In her words, one hears not vanity, but philosophy. She believed invention itself was a form of power. Subtle, yet lasting. Her devotion to mechanics often bled into her governance. She compared her council to a clock, each minister a gear that must move in harmony. When one failed, the whole machine faltered. She organized her household with precision, setting times for audiences, meals, and reports, all aligned with the ticking of her beloved clocks. Some complained of the rigidity, but others admired the efficiency. Under her rule, delays were rare and discipline steady, for everyone knew she valued order as much as curiosity. In private, she sometimes wrote of the comfort her machines gave her. When the gears turned, she confessed in a letter, "I feel the world itself is not chaos but pattern. The storm may rage, men may quarrel, but within the wheel there is always order." For a ruler surrounded by intrigue and uncertainty, perhaps her gadgets were more than entertainment. They were symbols of stability, proof that not everything in life was unpredictable. Stories of her passion spread far. Neighboring rulers sent her elaborate machines in hopes of winning her favor. A king from afar presented her with a clock that displayed the movement of planets, and she studied it for hours, marveling at its tiny orbs turning in harmony. Traders brought music boxes from distant lands, and she filled her chambers with their melodies, winding them one after another until the air was thick with overlapping tunes. Her court became known as a haven for inventors, a place where genius was rewarded more swiftly than noble birth. Yet perhaps the most telling detail of all was how she treated her machines not only as wonders, but as companions. She named some of them, speaking to them as though they might answer. A little bird that hopped across her table she called Feather, and when it chirped she laughed as though it truly sang. A doll that danced in circles she called Grace, and she often watched it for comfort during sleepless nights. To her, they were alive in spirit, if not in flesh, and their presence eased the solitude of her crown. When she grew old, her eyesight dimmed, yet she still demanded her machines. Servants wound them for her, placing them on her lap so she could feel their movement even when she could no longer see clearly. The ticking soothed her, a rhythm she carried into her final days. Some say that in her last hours she asked for her favorite clock to be placed beside her bed. As it chimed softly, she smiled and whispered, still turning. And then she drifted into silence. After her death, her collection became legendary. Many devices were dismantled, lost to time, but others survived, preserved as marvels of their age. Travelers centuries later gazed at them in wonder, imagining the queen who had once delighted in their movements. And though her political achievements faded in memory, her passion endured, for she had shown that curiosity itself can leave a mark as lasting as conquest. So when we remember her today, we need not picture only the solemn figure on a throne. We can imagine her bent over a table of gears and springs, candlelight glinting on her eyes as she traces the path of motion, smiling as metal comes alive beneath her touch. She was the queen who loved mechanical gadgets, who found joy not in jewels or crowns, but in the hum of invention, and who proved that even in the quiet ticking of a clock, a kind of eternity can be heard. Among all the queens whose names echo through Europe's chronicles, few have puzzled historians more than the one remembered for her endless unpredictability. She was not known for collecting objects, nor for storms or gadgets, nor for fashion, or letters. Her curiosity lay in something subtler and more elusive, the art of keeping everyone around her uncertain. Each day she seemed a different person, and no courtier, no minister, no foreign ambassador could ever be quite sure which queen they would meet when they stepped into her presence. In portraits, she appears serene, a steady gaze and calm composure. But those who lived in her orbit spoke of a ruler who could change her mood like the wind. On some mornings she was cheerful, walking through gardens with children, smiling at servants, even stooping to pluck flowers and tuck them behind her ear. Ministers who met her on such days found her generous and warm, listening with patience, granting favors, forgiving faults. Yet the very next morning the same queen could appear stern, her eyes cold, her voice clipped, her gestures sharp as blades. Courtiers trembled before her, fearing that a misstep might lead to dismissal or disgrace. No one could predict which version of her they would encounter. Diplomats dreaded their audiences, for a speech that pleased her 1 week might anger her the next. Some believed her moods were guided by strategy, that she deliberately shifted her tone to unsettle rivals and keep her counsel wary. Others whispered that she was simply mercurial by nature, her spirit restless and unfixed. Perhaps, as with so many curious queens, the truth was a mixture of both. Her unpredictability was not limited to temper. Her decisions, too, baffled observers. One day she might refuse a proposal outright, scolding its author for foolishness. The next day she approved the very same idea, praising its brilliance as though it had never crossed her desk before. Ministers learned to resubmit rejected plans in slightly altered forms, knowing that her mood might change. Foreign rulers tore their hair in frustration, unable to rely on her promises. She seemed to delight in the uncertainty, as though the very act of keeping others guessing gave her power. Indeed, it did. For a monarch, predictability could be dangerous. A rival who understood every thought, every pattern, could plan around it. But a queen who defied expectation was far harder to manipulate. Her courtiers never grew complacent, for they never knew where they stood. Ambassadors reported to their masters in confusion, unable to say whether her words signaled alliance or threat. By refusing to be easily understood, she made herself unassailable. Her court, however, lived in constant tension. One evening she laughed merrily at a jester's joke. The next evening she banished him for insolence. A noble might be showered with favor one month, then find himself suddenly ignored the next. Servants tiptoed through the palace, unsure whether a smile or a frown awaited them. Yet, curiously, they could not help but admire her. For when her warmth returned, it was genuine, radiant, enough to make one forget all the fear of the day before. She had the gift of making those around her crave her approval, even when it came sparingly. Stories of her shifting nature spread far. In taverns, people told tales of how she tricked foreign envoys by smiling sweetly before turning sharp as iron, leaving them stammering. In salons, nobles debated whether her unpredictability was genius or folly. Poets even likened her to the sea, calm one day, stormy the next, beautiful but dangerous always. She became legend not for consistency, but for the opposite, for her refusal to ever be entirely known. Yet for all her contradictions, she was not careless. Observers noticed that her changes of mood often coincided with negotiations. If she wished to delay a decision, she flew into sudden anger, making discussion impossible. If she wanted to push through a policy, she charmed her ministers with smiles until they yielded. If a foreign ambassador pressed too hard, she froze him out with silence, only to embrace him warmly days later, forcing him into confusion. She wielded unpredictability as a weapon sharper than any sword. Even her private life reflected this strange art. She might spend weeks secluded, speaking to no one but her closest attendants, then suddenly appear in public with great pageantry, dazzling the people with her presence. She might retreat into solitude during feasts, only to surprise her guests later by dancing until dawn. Friends who thought they knew her well confessed in letters that she was like quicksilver, always slipping from their grasp. No mask or disguise was needed for her. Her face itself was ever-changing, a riddle none could solve. Her ministers, exhausted, sometimes begged her for consistency. "Majesty," one complained, "we cannot serve if we cannot predict your will." She replied with a faint smile, "If you could always predict me, you would cease to respect me." It was an answer both infuriating and profound, for in her eyes predictability was weakness, and curiosity, even about her own self, was strength. When she died, her legacy puzzled historians as much as it had puzzled her court. Some painted her as unstable, a ruler whose shifting moods hindered stability. Others praised her cunning, arguing that her unpredictability kept rivals off balance and allowed her to survive where steadier rulers might have fallen. What all agreed upon was that she left behind a memory unlike any other, a queen who lived as a question mark, never an exclamation point. And perhaps that is what made her most curious of all. For while other monarchs are remembered by the battles they fought, the monuments they built, or the fashions they set, she is remembered by uncertainty itself, She remains, even now, a puzzle. Did she change because she could not help it, or because she willed it? Was she mercurial by chance or by design? The answer, like the queen herself, slips away each time we think we grasp it. So when we recall her tonight, let us imagine not a single portrait, but many. One day she is smiling in gardens, flowers in her hands. The next she is stern in council, eyes cold as marble. Another day she is laughing at a feast. Another she is silent in her chambers. All are true, all are false, all are fragments of a woman who kept everyone guessing. She was a queen who lived not by certainty, but by mystery. And in that mystery lies her enduring fascination.